Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Now, most podcasts put their promotion stuff and cup rattling halfway through or even towards the end. But of course, if all goes well, you're going to be asleep long before we get there, so I need to put this stuff up front. This show is brought to you by supporters on Patreon. I'm hearing from people all the time how valuable they find the show, and those supporters who have the means to help fund the show to keep it going and help me reach new audiences are always very much appreciated. So if you're someone who's making use of Sleepy Time Tales regularly to help you deal with sleeplessness, and you have the urge to support the show, and most importantly, if you can and have the means, please check out patreon.com/sleepytimetales or take a look at the link in the show notes or from the website and see what's available there. You will have the satisfaction of knowing that you're contributing to the rest and lifestyle improvement of thousands of people. And over and above that, there are real rewards available from as little as $2 a month. Over and above that knowledge, which I think is actually the really important part. From early release on the weekly episodes to special edits of the main show and even bonus episodes that come out every week. So there is something for any budget and a real benefit to you. This week I'd like to welcome back Alimo, a previous patron who dropped off for a while and has returned. Welcome back to Alimo. Thank you for your previous patronage, and also thank you to you and other people who provide a lot of other help and support besides the financial stuff. Because while finances help me keep the show going and help me justify the expense of running it and pay for my costs and stuff, and hopefully one day actually doing this full time, the other really huge way to help Sleepy Time Tales is simply to spread the word. If there is someone else in your life who you think will benefit from listening to it, who needs some help to sleep, just let them know. If you recommend the show on social media, please make sure to tag me in so that I know and I can thank you. You can tag me at Sleepy Time Tales on both Instagram and Twitter. Something that also helps a lot is shares and reviews on Facebook. I got a couple recently which were very nice that I've shared already. And those are a great way to actually help recommend to people in your life. A lot of people go on about Apple podcast reviews and that, and while those I enjoy, they don't really help you reach new audiences. What I'm all about is trying to help more people. So reviews and recommendations on Facebook and social media and in person really are the best way. I'm going to keep it short here tonight, so I'm just going to give my last shout out to the music. As ever, because it's such an important part of the show, is Untitled Chapter. Their music is available on the Free Music Archive, and I've linked their website in the show notes as they've got some very cool stuff. And they release under different names because they've got different styles that they work in, and I recommend checking it all out because it's all really good. Thank you for taking the time. Back to the show. So what exactly is Sleepy Time Tales? What is it for? It is a bit of a strange idea, after all, a podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to. One of the biggest compliments I get is from people who tell me they've never heard the end of it. But lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast that is intended to help those that can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night, mind spinning and emotions in turmoil with anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself not quite able to doze back off at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. Now, I'm someone who has struggled to sleep my whole life. Even when I was a baby, my parents had sleepless nights with me for years. And even once I got old enough not to bother them anymore, sleep was always a struggle for me. It was quite late in life, actually, when I discovered the tendency for droning voices, especially male ones, to act almost like a tranquilizer for me. I would go to bed with my podcasts ready to listen to all night because I was expecting to lie awake, and I'd find myself waking up having slept through everything I was trying to listen to. So I started listening to podcasts specifically to help me to sleep, and I worked through the backlogs of some of my old favorite shows and whatnot. And eventually one day I discovered that there are podcasts out there specifically for the purpose of helping you to sleep. I tried a couple, and that worked quite well for me, and I recommended them to other people, but quite sometimes they didn't quite resonate for various reasons. Sometimes they didn't like the topic or the story, or sometimes they just didn't like the narrator's voice. And I thought to myself, I've got a boring, deep, drony voice, so let me see if I can help reach people these other shows can't. And so I started up Sleepy Time Tales. Now, every episode starts with this long intro. It's something that, if there's a criticism of the show that I receive the most, it's this one, that this intro does go on all the time, and it's goes on for long, and it's in every single episode. But those criticisms do kind of miss the point. The story is a nice thing to have, but this intro really is what the show is about, because it's got two very important purposes. The first one is especially to explain it to new listeners. If you've discovered the show out of the blue or had it recommended to you, you might need me to make a bit of a case for you and to explain to you how I think it's helpful to use the show. And for older listeners, it serves a second purpose. Obviously, they know how to deal with the show, but for them, this intro is something familiar. It's part of the sort of environment that we're helping to build. I redo this intro every single episode. I don't just copy and paste it, but it's pretty much the same every time, except when I get lost and start wandering off in very random directions. But because what we're trying to do here is build a familiar, comfortable space, I give you this 15 minutes or so familiar, comfortable monologue to help you to build your environment. Now, as far as I know, there's a couple of possible ways to engage with the show. For me, when I listen to my sleep podcasts, I actually need something to listen to. I need a story or event or something that actually interests me enough to keep my mind on a specific point, to stop it from spinning out into stress and anxiety, to focus just enough not to resist the embrace of sleep when it comes for me. The second way I think people can engage with the show is to use it more like a white noise machine. Some people may need the sound of the ocean, or sound of rain, or wind in the trees, or maybe some boring dude just droning on in the background. Tonight's topic of that boring dude droning in the background is Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. It's the beginning of a murder mystery that was written in the 19th century about a body that was discovered in a cab after the driver had been driving him around for a while, and the mystery of solving what happened. Bit of a tense one at the beginning, but nothing too exciting happens, and there's a coroner's inquest that I think is extremely boring. I doubt anybody will make it through that, and that's a success. But whatever the story is about, the most important thing is that you don't try force sleep. Keep a light mental grip on the thread of the story and the questions and answers at the inquest, and allow the need for sleep to just come for you. Now, obviously, as I said, one of the highest pieces of praise I can get is people telling me they've never heard the end of the show. I'm hoping they're asleep before we get there, but it's important you don't feel pressurized. If this is your first night, it may not work for you. It may take a few nights for you to get used to listening to my voice. My accent may be a bit strange. Maybe the idea is a little bit strange, or maybe one episode just isn't long enough. What I actually do is, with my sleep podcasts, is I keep a whole bunch of the more recent episodes downloaded. And then when I go to bed, I just start on the latest episode and let them run through, because I am someone who I actually go to sleep okay these days. I don't really have much trouble falling asleep. But I wake up at 3 a.m. and sometimes I don't even know that I'm awake. But if my earbuds are in, I can just like settle back into my story. Or if they've popped out, I can put my earbuds back in and I can settle back in and back into that warm, comfortable environment that I've helped build myself. And also sometimes I even wake up a little bit before my alarm. Sometimes 30 or 60 minutes before my alarm goes, there I am lying awake. And you know what I do? I do the exact same thing. If my earbuds have fallen out, I pop them back in and I let myself go back to sleep. You may wonder, what is the point of that, Dave? Why does 30 minutes of extra sleep help? Surely it's, if anything, more of a distraction. And I'm going to tell you, sometimes that is the best part of my night. There's something about just allowing yourself to deeply relax on a profound level right before the alarm that's just satisfying, unlike almost anything else. But it's very important, whether you're trying to get to sleep or trying to go back to sleep or just squeezing a few more minutes in before your alarm goes, it's important that you relax into this. If you're new to the show and prone to late nights lying staring at the ceiling, this may seem strange to you. So I just request that you give it a chance. Especially if this is your first night, this may not work, so I suggest giving it like 2 or 3 episodes. That's my usual recommendation. If by the third night it's not working for you, I can even recommend you other shows that may resonate better. Things that work for me. I couldn't listen to myself. In fact, the host of one of the shows that I listen to, Boring Books for Bedtime, in an interview once said that trying to fall asleep to her own show would be like trying to tickle yourself, which I always quite liked. I would be far too uncomfortable to listen to myself talk in my sleep. Anyway, that's me wandering off again. So ultimately, we have the basic idea. You relax and you lie in the dark, and while you do that, I tell you a tale. So relax, dear listener, my nighttime friend who has elected to lie in the dark, listening to my voice. You will always be safe with me, because I'm here to help you relax, to do my small part to improve your life in a big way. Because people don't sleep very well these days, and lack of sleep really does make life harder. So I'm here to do my part to help you to face tomorrow and the day after well rested and better able to cope and process. I believe very strongly in the benefits of kindness. I want to be kind to you. I want to share kindness with you. But most importantly, I need you to be kind to yourself. Don't beat yourself up or rebuke yourself over not sleeping. Don't get tense if you just can't get yourself over the edge of sleep, even with me here in your ears trying to help. Frustration is one of the great enemies of a good night's sleep, and the intention with this podcast is to short-circuit that frustration, to distract the feeling we get when we blame ourselves for not being able to let go and drift into the dark. So take a breath. Forgive the fact you can't sleep and let my voice wash over you. Take another breath. Imagine the warm darkness rising up, inviting you to sleep into a better life starting tomorrow. And if you can't let go, forgive yourself and we can try again tomorrow. If you've had a life of insomnia, sleep is something like an enemy. But it's not your enemy. It's a natural process that we've been pulled away from by stress and life and progress that shines bright lights in our eyes at all hours. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course, you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Preface. In its original form, The Mystery of a Hansom Cab has reached sale of 375,000 copies in this country, and some few editions in the United States of America. Notwithstanding this, the present publishers have the best of reasons for believing that there are thousands of persons whom the book has never reached. The causes of this have doubtless been many, but chief among them was the form of the publication itself. It is for this section of the public chiefly that the present edition is issued. In placing it before my new readers, I have been asked by the publishers thoroughly to revise the work, and at the same time to set at rest the many conflicting reports concerning it, and myself, which have been current since its initial issue. The first of these requests I have complied with, and the many typographic and other errors which disfigured this first edition have, I think I can safely say, now disappeared. The second request I am about to fulfill, but in order to do so, I must ask my readers to go back with me to the beginning of all things, so far as this special book is concerned. The writing of the book was due more to accident than to design. I was bent on becoming a dramatist, but being quite unknown, I found it impossible to induce the managers of the Melbourne theatres to accept or even to read a play. At length it occurred to me I might further my purpose by writing a novel. I should at all events secure a certain amount of local attention. Up to that time I had written only 1 or 2 short stories, and The Cab was not only the first book I ever published, but the first book I ever wrote. So to youth and lack of experience must be ascribed what was wanting in the book. I repeat that the story was written only to attract local attention, and no one was more astonished than I when it passed beyond the narrow circle for which it had originally been intended. My mind made up on this point, I inquired of a leading Melbourne bookseller what style of book he sold most of. He replied that the detective stories of Gaboriau had a large sale, and as at this time I had never even heard of the author, I bought all his works, 11 or thereabouts, and read them carefully. The style of these stories attracted me, and I determined to write a book of the same class, containing a murder, a mystery, and the description of low life in Melbourne. This was the origin of The Cab. A central idea, i.e. the murder in a cab, came to me while driving at a late hour to St Kilda, a suburb of Melbourne, but it took some time and much thought to work it out to a logical conclusion. I was 2 months sketching out the skeleton of the novel, but even so, when I had written it, the result proved unsatisfactory. For I found I had not sufficiently well concealed the mystery upon which the whole interest of the book depended. In the first draft I made Frettlby the criminal, but on reading over the manuscript I found that his guilt was so obvious that I wrote out the story for a second time, introducing the character of Morland as a scapegoat. Mother Guttersnipe I unearthed in the slums of Little Bourke Street, and gave what I am afraid was perhaps too vivid a picture of her language and personality. These I have toned down in the present edition. Kelton and the 2 lodging house keepers were actual personages whom I knew very well, and I do not think I have exaggerated their idiosyncrasies. Although many have, I believe, doubted the existence of such oddities. All the scenes in the book, especially the slums, are described from personal observation, and I passed a great many nights in Little Bourke Street gathering material. Having completed the book, I tried to get it published, but every one to whom I offered it refused even to look at the manuscript, on the ground that no colonial could write anything worth reading. They gave no reason for this extraordinary opinion, but it was sufficient for them, and they laughed to scorn the idea that any good could come out of Nazareth, i.e. the colonies. The story, thus being boycotted on all hands, I determined to publish it myself, and accordingly an edition of, I think, some 5,000 copies was brought out at my own cost. Contrary to the expectations of the publishers, and I must add to my own, the whole edition went off in 3 weeks, and the public demanded a second. This also sold rapidly, and after some months, proposals were made to me that the book should be brought out in London. Later on, I parted with the book to several speculators, who formed themselves into what they called the Hansom Cab Publishing Company. Taking the book to London, they published it there with great success, and it had a phenomenal sale which brought in a large sum of money. The success was, in the first instance, due in no small degree to a very kind and generous criticism written by Mr. Clement Scott. I may here state that I had nothing to do with the company, nor did I receive any money for the English sale of the book beyond what I sold it for. And as a matter of fact, I did not arrive in England until a year after the novel was published. I have heard it declared that the plot is founded on a real criminal case, but such a statement is utterly without foundation, as the story is pure fiction from beginning to end. Several people before and since my arrival in England have assumed the authorship of the book to themselves, and one gentleman went so far as to declare that he would shoot me if I claimed to have written it. I am glad to say that up to the present he has not carried out his intention. Another individual had his cards printed, Fergus Hume, author of The Mystery of a Hansom Cab, and also added the price for which he was prepared to write a similar book. Many of the papers put this last piece of eccentricity down to my account. I may state in conclusion that I belong to New Zealand, and not to Australia, that I am a barrister and not a retired policeman, that I am yet 2 decades or 50 years of age, that Fergus Hume is my real name and not a nom de plume, and finally that far from making a fortune out of the book, all I received for the English and American rights previous to the issue of this revised edition by my present publishers was the sum of £50. With this I take my leave, and I trust that the present edition may prove as successful as did the first. Chapter 1. What the Argus Said. The following report appeared in the Argus newspaper of Saturday, the 28th of July, 18. Truth is said to be stranger than fiction, and certainly the extraordinary murder which took place in Melbourne on Thursday night, or rather Friday morning, goes a long way towards verifying this saying. A crime has been committed by an unknown assassin within a short distance of the principal streets of this great city, and is surrounded by an impenetrable mystery. Indeed, from the nature of the crime itself, the place where it was committed, and the fact that the assassin has escaped without leaving a trace behind him, it would seem as though the case itself had been taken bodily from one of Gaboriau's novels, and that his famous detective Lecoq alone would be able to unravel it. The facts of the case are simply these. On the 27th day of July, at the hour of 20 minutes to 2 o'clock in the morning, a hansom cab drove up to the police station in Grey Street, St Kilda, and the driver made the startling statement that his cab contained the body of a man who he had reason to believe had been murdered. Being taken into the presence of the inspector, the cabman, who gave his name as Malcolm Royston, related the following strange story. At the hour of 1 o'clock in the morning, he was driving down Collins Street East, when, as he was passing the Burke and Wills monument, he was hailed by a gentleman standing at the corner by the Scotch church. He immediately drove up and saw that the gentleman who hailed him was supporting the deceased, who appeared to be intoxicated. Both were in evening dress, but the deceased had on no overcoat, while the other wore a short covert coat of a light fawn colour, which was open. As Royston drove up, the gentleman in the light coat said, "Look here, cabby, here's some fellow awfully tight, you'd better take him home." Royston then asked him if the drunken man was his friend, but this other denied, saying that he had just picked him up from the footpath and did not know him from Adam. At this moment, the deceased turned his face up to the light of the lamp under which both were standing, and the other seemed to recognize him, for he recoiled a pace, letting the drunken man fall in a heap on the pavement and gasping out, "You!" He turned on his heel and walked rapidly away down Russell Street in the direction of Burke Street. Royston was staring after him and wondering at his strange conduct, when he was recalled to himself by the voice of the deceased, who had struggled to his feet and was holding onto the lamppost, swaying to and fro. "I want to go home," he said in a thick voice. "St. Kilda." He then tried to get into the cab, but was too drunk to do so, and finally sat down again on the pavement. Seeing this, Royston got down and, lifting him up, helped him into the cab with some considerable difficulty. The deceased fell back into the cab and seemed to drop off to sleep, so after closing the door, Royston turned to remount his driving seat, when he found the gentleman in the light coat whom he had seen holding up the deceased close to his elbow. Royston said, "Oh, you've come back," and the other answered, "Yes, I've changed my mind and I will see him home." As he said this, he opened the door to the cab, stepped in beside the deceased, and told Royston to drive down to St. Kilda. Royston, who was glad that the friend of the deceased had come to look after him, drove as he had been directed. But near the Church of England Grammar School, on the St. Kilda Road, the gentleman in the light coat called out to him to stop. He did so, and the gentleman got out of the cab, closing the door after him. "He won't let me take him home," he said, "so I'll just walk back to the city and you can drive him to St. Kilda." "What street, sir?" asked Royston. "Grey Street, I fancy," said the other, "but my friend will direct you when you get to the junction." "Ain't he too much on, sir?" said Royston dubiously. "Oh no, I think he'll be able to tell you where he lives. It's Grey Street or Ackland Street, I fancy, I don't know which." He then opened the door of the cab and looked in. "Good night, old man," he said. The other apparently did not answer, for the gentleman in the light coat, shrugging his shoulders and muttering "sulky brute," closed the door again. He then gave Royston half a sovereign, lit a cigarette, and after making a few remarks about the beauty of the night, walked off quickly in the direction of Melbourne. Royston drove down to the junction, and having stopped there, according to his instructions, he asked his fare several times where he was to drive him to. Receiving no response and thinking that the deceased was too drunk to answer, he got down from his seat, opened the door of the cab, and found the deceased lying back in the corner with his handkerchief across his mouth. He put out his hand with the intention of rousing him, thinking that he had gone to sleep. But on touching him, the deceased fell forward, and on examination, to his horror, he found that he was quite dead. Alarmed at what had taken place, and suspecting the gentleman in the light coat, he drove to the police station at St. Kilda, and there made the above report. The body of the deceased was taken out of the cab and brought into the station, a doctor being sent for at once. On his arrival, however, he found that life was quite extinct, and also discovered that the handkerchief, which was tied lightly over the mouth, was saturated with chloroform. He had no hesitation in stating that from the way in which the handkerchief was placed and the presence of chloroform, that a murder had been committed, and from all appearances the deceased died easily and without a struggle. The deceased is a slender man of medium height with a dark complexion, and is dressed in evening dress, which will render identification difficult, as it is a costume which has no distinctive mark to render it noticeable. There were no papers or cards found on the deceased from which his name could be discovered, and the clothing was not marked in any way. The handkerchief, however, which was tied across his mouth, was of white silk, and marked in one of the corners with the letters O.W. in red silk. The assassin, of course, may have used his own handkerchief to commit the crime, so that if the initials are those of his name, they may ultimately lead to his detection. There will be an inquest held on the body of the deceased this morning, when no doubt some evidence may be elicited which may solve the mystery. In Monday morning's issue of the Argus, the following article appeared with reference to the matter. The following additional evidence which has been obtained may throw some light on the mysterious murder in a Hansom Cab, of which we gave him a full description in Saturday's issue. Another hansom cabman called at the police officer and gave a clue which will no doubt prove of value to the detectives in their search for the murderer. He states that he was driving up to St. Kilda Road on Friday morning about 1:30 when he was hailed by a gentleman in a light coat, who stepped into the cab and told him to drive to Powell Street in East Melbourne. He did so, and after paying him, the gentleman got out at the corner of Wellington Parade and Powlett Street and walked slowly up Powlett Street while the cab drove back to town. Here all clue ends, but there can be no doubt in the minds of our readers as to the identity of the man in the light coat who got out of Royston's cab on St Kilda Road, with the one who entered the other cab and alighted therefrom at Powlett Street. There could have been no struggle, as had any taken place, the cabman Royston surely would have heard the noise. The supposition is therefore that the deceased was too drunk to make any resistance, and that the other, watching his opportunity, placed the handkerchief saturated with chloroform over the mouth of his victim. Then, after perhaps a few ineffectual struggles, the latter would succumb to the effects of his inhalation. The man in the light coat, judging from his conduct before getting into the cab, appears to have known the deceased, though the circumstance of his walking away on recognition and returning again shows that his attitude towards the deceased was not altogether a friendly one. The difficulty is where to start from in the search after the author of what appears to be a deliberate murder, as the deceased seems to be unknown and his presumed murderer has escaped. But it is impossible that the body can remain long without being identified by someone, as though Melbourne is a large city, yet it is neither Paris nor London, where a man can disappear in a crowd and never be heard of again. The first thing to be done is to establish the identity of the deceased, and then no doubt a clue will be obtained, leading to the detection of the man in the light coat, who appears to have been the perpetrator of the crime. It is of the utmost importance that the mystery in which the crime is shrouded should be cleared up, not only in the interest of justice, but also in those of the public, taking place as it did in a public conveyance and in the public street. To think that the author of such a crime is at present at large, walking in our midst, and perhaps preparing for the committal of another, is enough to shake at the strongest nerves. In one of du Boisgobey's stories, entitled An Omnibus Mystery, a murder closely resembling this tragedy takes place in an omnibus, but we question if even that author could have been daring enough to write about a crime being committed in such an unlikely place as a hansom cab. Here is a great chance for some of our detectives to render themselves famous, and we feel sure that they will do their utmost to trace the author of this cowardly and dastardly murder. Chapter 2. The Evidence at the Inquest. At the inquest held on the body found in the Hansom Cab, the following articles taken from the deceased were placed on the table: £2 10 shillings in gold and silver, the white handkerchief which was saturated with chloroform and was found tied across the mouth of the deceased, marked with the letters OW in red silk, a cigarette case of Russian leather, half filled with old Judge cigarettes, a left-hand white glove of kid, rather soiled, with black seams down the back. Samuel Gorby of the detective's office was present in order to see if anything might be said by the witnesses likely to point to the cause or author of the crime. The first witness called was Malcolm Royston, in whose cab the crime had been committed. He told the same story as had already appeared in the Argus, and the following facts were elicited by the coroner. Question: Can you give a description of the gentleman in the light coat who was holding the deceased when you drove up? Answer: I did not observe him very closely, as my attention was taken up by the deceased, and besides, the gentleman in the light coat was in the shadow. Describe him from what you saw of him. He was fair, I think, because I could see his moustache, rather tall and in evening dress with a light coat over it. I could not see his face very plainly, as he wore a soft felt hat, which is pulled down over his eyes. What kind of hat was it he wore? A wide awake? Yes, the brim was turned down and I could only see his mouth and moustache. What did he say when you asked him if he knew the deceased? He said he didn't, that he had just picked him up. And afterwards he seemed to recognize him? Yes. When the deceased looked up, he said "you" and let him fall onto the ground, as then he walked away towards Burke Street. Did he look back? Not that I saw. How long were you looking after him? About a minute. And when did you see him again? After I put deceased into the cab, I turned around and found him at my elbow. And what did he say? I said, "Oh, you've come back." And he said, "Yes, I've changed my mind and I'll see him home." And then he got into the cab and told me to drive to St. Kilda. He spoke then as if he knew the deceased. Yes, I thought he'd recognized him only when he looked up and perhaps having had a row with him walked away, but thought he'd come back. Did you see him coming back? No, the first I saw of him was at my elbow when I turned. And when did he get out? Just as I was turning down by the grammar school on the St. Kilda Road. Did you hear any sounds of fighting or struggling in the cab during the drive? No, the road was rather rough and the noise of the wheels going over the stones would have prevented my hearing anything. When the gentleman in the light coat got out, did he appear disturbed? No, he was perfectly calm. How could you tell that? Because the moon had risen and I could see plainly. Did you see his face then? No, his hat was pulled down over it. Only saw as much as I did when he entered the cab in Collins Street. Were his clothes torn or disarranged in any way? No, the only difference I remarked in him was that his coat was buttoned. And was it open when he got in? No, but it was when he was holding up the deceased. Then he buttoned it before he came back and got into the cab. Yes, I suppose so. What did he say when he got out of the cab on St. Kilda Road? He said that the deceased would not let him take him home, that he would walk back to Melbourne. And you asked him where you were to drive the deceased to? Yes, and he said that the deceased lived either in Grey Street or Ackland Street, St. Kilda, but that the deceased would direct me at the junction. Did you not think that the deceased was too drunk to direct you? Yes, I did, but his friend said that the sleep and the shaking of the cab would sober him a bit by the time I got to the junction. The gentleman in the light coat apparently did not know where the deceased lived. No, he said it was either in Ackland Street or Grey Street. Did you not think that curious? No, I thought he might be a club friend of the deceased. For how long did the man in the light coat talk to you? About 5 minutes. And during that time you heard no noise in the cab? No, I thought the deceased had gone to sleep. And after the man in the light coat said good night to the deceased, what happened? He lit a cigarette, gave me a half-sovereign, and walked off towards Melbourne. Did you observe if the gentleman in the light coat had his handkerchief with him? Oh yes, because he dusted his boots with it. The road was very dusty. Did you notice any striking peculiarity about him? Well, no, except that he wore a diamond ring. What was there peculiar about that? He wore it on the forefinger of the right hand. I never saw it that way before. When did you notice this? When he was lighting his cigarette. How often did you call to the deceased when you got to the junction? 3 or 4 times. Then I got down and found he was quite dead. How was he lying? He was doubled up in the far corner of the cab, very much in the same position as I left him when I put him in. His head was hanging on one side and there was a handkerchief across his mouth. When I touched him, he fell into the other corner of the cab and then I found out he was dead. I immediately drove to the St. Kilda police station and told the police. At the conclusion of Royston's evidence, during which Gorby had been continually taking notes, Robert Chinston was called. He deposed, "I am a duly qualified medical practitioner residing in Collins Street East. I made a post-mortem examination of the body of the deceased on Friday." That was within a few hours of his death. Yes. Judging from the position of the handkerchief and the presence of chloroform that the deceased had died from the effects of anesthesia, and knowing how quickly the poison evaporates, I made the examination at once. Go on, sir. Externally, the body was healthy-looking and well-nourished. There were no marks of violence. The staining apparent at the back of the legs and trunk was due to post-mortem congestion. Internally, the brain was hyperemic and there was a considerable amount of congestion, especially apparent in the superficial vessels. There was no brain disease. The lungs were healthy but slightly congested. On opening the thorax, there was a faint spirituous odor discernible. The stomach contained about a pint of completely digested food. The heart was flaccid. The right heart contained a considerable quantity of dark fluid blood. There was a tendency to fatty degeneration of that organ. I am of the opinion that the deceased died from the inhalation of certain such vapor as chloroform or methylene. You say there was a tendency to fatty degeneration of the heart. Would that have anything to do with the death of deceased? Not of itself, but chloroform administered while the heart was in such a state would have a decided tendency to accelerate the fatal result. At the same time, I may mention that post-mortem signs of poisoning by chloroform are mostly negative. Dr. Chinston was then permitted to retire, and Clement Rankin, another hansom cabman, was called. He deposed, "I am a cabman living in Collingwood, and usually drive a hansom cab. I remember Thursday last. I had driven a party down to St Kilda and was returning about 1:30. A short distance past the grammar school, I was hailed by a gentleman in a light coat. He was smoking a cigarette and told me to drive him to Powlett Street, East Melbourne. I did so, and he got out at the corner of Wellington Parade and Powlett Street. He paid me half a sovereign for my fare and then walked up Powlett Street while I drove back to town." "What time was it you stopped at Powlett Street?" 2:00 exactly. "How do you know?" "Because it was a still night and I heard the post office clock strike 2:00. "Did you notice anything peculiar about the man in the light coat?" "No, he looked just the same as anyone else. I thought he was some swell of the town out for a lark. His hat was pulled down over his eyes and I could not see his face." "Did you notice if he wore a ring?" "Yes, I did. When he was handing me the half sovereign, I saw he had a diamond ring on the forefinger of his right hand." "He did not say why he was on the St Kilda Road at such an hour?" "No, he did not." Clement Rankin was then ordered to stand down, and the coroner then summed up in an address of half an hour's duration. There was, he pointed out, no doubt that the death of the deceased had resulted not from natural causes, but from the effects of poisoning. Only slight evidence had been obtained up to the present time regarding the circumstances of the case, but the only person who could be accused of committing the crime was the unknown man who entered the cab with the deceased on Friday morning at the corner of the Scotch Church near the Burke and Wills Monument. It had been proved that the deceased, when he entered the cab, was to all appearances in good health, though in a state of intoxication, and the fact that it was found by the cabman Royston, after the man in the light coat had left the cab with a handkerchief saturated with chloroform tied over his mouth, would seem to show that he had died through the inhalation of chloroform, which had been deliberately administered. All the obtainable evidence in the case was circumstantial, but nevertheless showed conclusively that a crime had been committed. Therefore, as the circumstances of the case pointed to one conclusion, the jury could not do otherwise than frame a verdict in accordance with that conclusion. The jury retired at 4:00 and after an absence of a quarter of an hour returned with the following verdict: that the deceased, whose name there is no evidence to determine, died on the 27th day of July from the effects of poison, namely chloroform, feloniously administered by some person unknown, and the jury, on their oaths, say that the unknown person feloniously, wilfully, and maliciously did murder the said deceased. Chapter 3. £100 Reward. Murder, £100 Reward. Whereas on Friday the 27th day of July, the body of a man, named unknown, was found in a hansom cab, and whereas at an inquest held at St Kilda on the 30th day of July, a verdict of wilful murder against some person unknown was brought in by the jury. The deceased is of medium height, with a dark complexion, dark hair, clean-shaved, has a mole on the left temple, and was dressed in evening dress. Notice is hereby given that a reward of £100 will be paid by the government for such information as will lead to the conviction of the murderer, who is presumed to be a man who entered the Hansom Cab with the deceased at the corner of Rollins and Russell Streets on the morning of the 27th of July. Chapter 4. Mr. Gorby makes a start. "Well," said Mr. Gorby, addressing his reflection in the looking-glass, "I've been finding out things these last 20 years, but this is a puzzler and no mistake." Mr. Gorby was shaving and, as was his usual custom, conversed with his reflection. Being a detective and of an extremely reticent disposition, he never talked outside about his business, or made a confidant of anyone. When he did want to unbosom himself, he retired to his bedroom and talked to his reflection in the mirror. This method of procedure he found to work capitally, for it relieved his sometimes overburdened mind with absolute security to himself. Did not the barber of Midas, when he found out what was under the royal crown of his master, fret and chafe over his secret, until one morning he stole to the reeds by the river and whispered, "Midas has ass's ears"? In the like manner, Mr. Gorby felt a longing at times to give speech to his innermost secrets, and having no fancy for chattering to the air, he made his mirror his confidant. So far it had never betrayed him, while for the rest it had joyed him to see his own jolly red face nodding gravely at him from out the shining surface, like a mandarin. This morning the detective was unusually animated in his confidences to the mirror. At times, too, a puzzled expression would pass over his face. The Hansom Cab murder had been placed in his hands for a solution, and he was trying to think how he should make a beginning. "Hang it," he said, thoughtfully stropping his razor. "A thing with an end must have a start, and if I don't get the start, how am I to get the end?" As the mirror did not answer this question, Mr. Gorby lathered his face, and started shaving in a somewhat mechanical fashion. For his thoughts were with the case, and ran on in this manner. Here's a man, well, say a gentleman, who gets drunk, and therefore doesn't know what he's up to. Another gent who's on the square comes up and sings out for a cab for him. First he says he doesn't know him, and then he shows plainly he does, and walks away in a temper. Changes his mind, comes back, and gets into the cab, after telling the cabbie to drive down to St. Kilda. Then he polishes the drunk one off with chloroform, gets out of the cab, jumps into another, and after getting out to Powlett Street, vanishes. That's the riddle I've got to find out, and I don't think the Sphinx ever had a harder one. There are 3 things to be discovered. First, who is the dead man? Second, what was he killed for? And third, who did it? Once I get hold of the first, the other 2 won't be very hard to find out, for one can tell pretty much from a man's life whether it's to anyone's interest that he should be got off the books. The man that murdered that chap must have had a strong motive, and I must find out what that motive was. Love? No, it wasn't that. Men in love don't go to such lengths in real life. They do in novels and plays, but I've never seen it occurring in my experience. Robbery? No, there was plenty of money in his pocket. Revenge? Now really it might be that, as a kind of thing that carries most people further than they want to go. There was no violence used, for his clothes weren't torn, so he must have been taken sudden, and before he knew what the other chap was up to. By the way, I don't think I examined his clothes sufficiently. There might be something about them to give a clue. At any rate, it's worth looking after, so I'll start with his clothes. So Mr. Gorby, having dressed and breakfasted, walked quickly to the police station, where he asked for the clothes of the deceased to be shown to him. When he received them, he retired into a corner and commenced an exhaustive examination of them. There was nothing remarkable about the coat. It was merely a well-cut and well-made dress coat, so with a grunt of dissatisfaction Mr. Gorby threw it aside and picked up the waistcoat. Here he found something to interest him, in the shape of a pocket made on the left-hand side and on the inside of the garment. "Now what the deuce is this for?" said Mr. Gorby, scratching his head. "It ain't usual for a dress waistcoat to have a pocket on its inside, as I'm aware of." "And," continued the detective, greatly excited, "the same tailor's work. He did it himself, and jolly badly he did it too." Now he must have taken the trouble to make this pocket himself so that no one else would know anything about it, and it was made to carry something valuable. So valuable that he had to carry it with him even when he wore evening clothes. Ah, here's a tear on the side nearest the outside of the waistcoat. Something has been pulled out roughly. I begin to see now. The dead man possessed something which the other man wanted, and which he knew the dead one carried about with him. He sees him drunk, gets into the cab with him, and tries to get what he wants. The dead man resists, upon which the other kills him by means of the chloroform which he had with him, and being afraid that the cab will stop, and he will be found out, snatches what he wants out of the pocket so quickly that he tears the waistcoat and then makes off. That's clear enough, but the question is, what was it he wanted? A case with jewels? No, it could not have been anything so bulky, or the dead man would never have carried it about inside his waistcoat. It was something flat, which could easily lie in the pocket. A paper, some valuable paper which the assassin wanted, and for which he killed the other. This is all very well, said Mr. Gorby, throwing down the waistcoat and rising. I have found number 2 before number 1. The first question is, who is the murdered man? He's a stranger in Melbourne, that's pretty clear, or else someone would have been sure to recognize him before now by the description given in the reward. Now I wonder if he has any relations here. No, he can't, or else they would have made inquiries before this. Well, there's one thing certain. He must have had a landlady or landlord, unless he slept in the open air. He can't have lived in a hotel, as the landlord of any hotel in Melbourne would have recognized him from the description, especially when the whole place is ringing with the murder. Private lodgings more like, and a landlady who doesn't read the papers, and doesn't gossip, or she'd have known all about it by this time. Now, if he did live, as I think, in private lodgings and suddenly disappeared, his landlady wouldn't keep quiet. It's a whole week since the murder, and as the lodger has not been seen or heard of, the lady will naturally make inquiries. If, however, as I surmise, the lodger is a stranger, she will not know where to inquire. Therefore, under these circumstances, the most natural thing for her to do would be to advertise for him. So I'll have a look at the newspapers. Mr. Gorby got a file of the different newspapers, and looked carefully through these columns in which missing friends and people who will hear something to their advantage are generally advertised for. He was murdered, said Mr. Gorby to himself, on a Friday morning between 1 and 2 o'clock. So he might stay away till Monday without exciting any suspicion. On Monday, however, the landlady would begin to feel uneasy, and on Tuesday she would advertise for him. Therefore, said Mr. Gorby, running his fat finger down the column, Wednesday it is. It did not appear in Wednesday's paper, neither did it in Thursday's. But in Friday's issue, exactly 1 week after the murder, Mr. Gorby came upon the following advertisement. If Mr. Oliver White does not return to Possum Villa, Grey Street, St. Kilda, before the end of the week, his rooms will be let again. Robina Hableton. Oliver White, repeated Mr. Gorby slowly, and the initials on the pockets of a handkerchief which were proved to belong to the deceased were O.W. So his name is Oliver White, is it? Now I wonder if Robina Hableton knows anything about this matter. At any rate, said Mr. Gorby, putting on his hat, as I'm fond of sea breezes, I think I'll go down and call at Possum Villa, Grey Street, St. Kilda. Chapter 5. Mrs. Hamilton unbosoms herself. Mrs. Hableton was a lady with a grievance, as anybody who happened to become acquainted with her soon found out. It is Beaconsfield who says in one of his novels that no one is so interesting as when he is talking about himself, and judging Mrs. Hableton by this statement, she was an extremely fascinating individual, as she never by any chance talked upon any other subject. What was the threat of a Russian invasion to her as long as she had a special grievance? Once let that be removed, and she would have time to attend to such minor details as affected the colony. Mrs. Hableton's particular grievance was want of money. Not by any means an uncommon one, you might remind her, but she snappishly would tell you that she knowed that, but some people weren't like other people. In time, one came to learn what she meant by this. She had come to the colonies in the early days when the making of money in appreciable quantities was an easier matter than it is now. Owing to a bad husband, she had failed to save any. The late Mr. Hableton, for he had long since departed this life, had been addicted to alcohol, and at those times when he should have been earning, he was usually to be found in drinking shanty, spending his wife's earnings in shouting for himself and his friends. The constant drink in the hot Victorian climate soon carried him off, and when Mrs. Hableton had seen him safely under the ground in the Melbourne cemetery, she returned home to survey her position and see how it could be bettered. She gathered together a little money from the wreck of her fortune, and land being cheap, purchased a small section at St Kilda and built a house on it. She supported herself by going out chairing, taking in sewing, and acting as a sick nurse. So among this multiplicity of occupations, she managed to exist fairly well. And in truth, it was somewhat hard upon Mrs. Hableton. For a time when she should have been resting and reaping the fruit of her early industry, she was obliged to toil more assiduously than ever. It was little consolation to her that she was but a type of many women, who, hard-working and thrifty themselves, are married to men who are nothing but an incubus to their wives and to their families. Small wonder then that Mrs. Hableton should condense all her knowledge of the male sex into the one bitter aphorism, men as brutes. Possum Villa was an unpretentious-looking place, with one bow window and a narrow veranda in front. It was surrounded by a small garden in which were a few sparse flowers, the special delight of Mrs. Hableton. It was her way to tie an old handkerchief around her head and to go out into the garden and dig and water her beloved flowers, until from sheer desperation at the overwhelming odds they gave up all attempt to grow. She was engaged in this favourite occupation about a week after her lodger had gone. She wondered where he was. Lying drunk in a public house, I'll be bound, she said, viciously pulling up a weed, a spin in his rent and a spill in his inside with beer. Ah, men as brutes, drat 'em. Just as she said this, a shadow fell across the garden, and on looking up, she saw a man leaning over the fence, staring at her. Get out, she said sharply, rising from her knees and shaking her trowel at the intruder. I don't want no apples today, and I don't care how cheap you sells 'em. Mrs. Hableton apparently laboured under the delusion that the man was a hawker, but seeing no handcart with him, she changed her mind. You're taking a plan of the house to rob it, are you? She said. Well, you needn't, 'cause I ain't living to rob. The silver spoons as belonged to my father's mother haven't gone down my husband's throat years ago, and I ain't got had money to buy more. I'm a lone person as it is put on by brutes like you, and I'll thank you to leave the fence I brought with my own hard-earned money alone and get out. Mrs. Hableton stopped short for want of breath, and stood shaking her trowel and gasping like a fish out of water. My dear lady, said the man at the fence mildly, are you? No, I ain't, retorted Mrs. Hableton fiercely. I ain't neither a member of the house nor a schoolteacher to answer your questions. I'm a woman as pays my rates and taxes, and don't gossip, nor read your rubbish in newspapers, nor care for the Russians. No how, so get out. Don't read the papers, repeated the man, in a satisfied tone. Ah, that accounts for it. Mrs. Hableton stared suspiciously at the intruder. He was a burly-looking man with a jovial red face, clean-shaven, and his sharp, shrewd-looking grey eyes twinkled like two stars. He was well dressed in a suit of light clothes, and wore a stiffly starched white waistcoat with a massive gold chain stretched across it. Altogether, he gave Mrs. Hableton finally the impression of being a well-to-do tradesman, and she mentally wondered what he wanted. What do you want? She asked abruptly. Does Mr. Oliver White live here? Asked the stranger. He do and he don't, answered Mrs. Hableton epigrammatically. I ain't seen him in over a week, so I suppose he's gone on the drink like the rest of 'em. But I put something in the paper as I'll put him up pretty sharp and let him know I ain't a carpet to be trod on, And if you're a friend of him, you can tell him from me he's a brute, and it's no more but what I expected of him, being a male. The stranger waited placidly during the outburst, and Mrs. Hableton, having stopped for want of breath, he interposed quietly. Can I speak to you for a few moments? And who's the stopping of you? Said Mrs. Hableton defiantly. Go on with you, not as I expect the truth from a male, but go on. Well, really, said the other, looking up at the cloudless blue sky and wiping his face with a gaudy red silk pocket handkerchief. It is rather hot, you know, and Mrs. Hableton did not give him time to finish, but walking to the gate, opened it with a jerk. Use your legs and walk in, she said. And the stranger having done so, she led the way into the house, and into a small, neat sitting room, which seemed to overflow with antimacassars, wool mats, and wax flowers. There was also a row of emu eggs on the mantelpiece, a cutlass on the wall, and a grimy line of hard-looking little books, set in a stiff row on a shelf, presumably for ornament, for their appearance in no way tempted one to read them. The furniture was of horsehair, and everything was hard and shiny, so when the stranger sat down in the slippery-looking armchair that Mrs. Hableton pushed towards him, he could not help thinking it had been stuffed with stones, it felt so cold and hard. The lady herself sat opposite to him in another hard chair, and having taken the handkerchief off her head, folded it carefully, put it on her lap, and then looked straight at her unexpected visitor. Now then, she said, letting her mouth fly open so rapidly that it gave one the impression that it was moved by strings like a marionette. Who are you? What are you? What do you want? The stranger put his red silk handkerchief into his hat, placed it on the table, and answered deliberately. My name is Gorby. I'm a detective. I want Mr. Oliver White. He ain't here, said Mrs. Hableton, thinking that White had got into trouble and was in danger of arrest. I know that, answered Mr. Gorby. Then where is he? Mr. Gorby answered abruptly, and watched the effect of his words. He is dead. Mrs. Hableton grew pale, and pushed back her chair. No, she cried. He never killed him, did he? Who never killed him? Queried Mr. Gorby sharply. Mrs. Hableton evidently knew more than she intended to say. Recovering herself with a violent effort, she answered evasively. He never killed himself. Mr. Gorby looked at her keenly, and she returned his gaze with a defiant stare. And I think I'm going to leave it there for tonight. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, you can find the book on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Undesire by Kumiko. Check out more of their work on their website, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.